Hello and welcome to Jaw Law. I'm your host, Joe McGregor from Dallas, Texas, and today we're talking about employee handbooks.
Any material communicated on this podcast is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to be legal advice. Nothing herein should be considered to create an attorney-client relationship. Please consult an attorney for legal advice on your matter.
Welcome, everyone, and I hope everyone is having a fun holiday season. Today, we're going to talk about something that has come up a couple times, really throughout the year, so it's not necessarily that it's this recent, but I've been meaning to do an episode about employee handbooks. This is a regular question that we get, and like I said, we've had a couple of issues pop up, and I'll explain it, and I don't want to get too specific, but I've tried to condense down a couple of what I think are useful pointers about employee handbooks. All right, first of all, let me tell you who my target audience is. My target audience today is specifically practice owners. Yes, some of this information is going to be useful as an associate, but mostly I'm trying to guide practice owners and not just new practice owners. Some of these issues that we've had to deal with this year have actually been from people who have had practices for a long time, and their employee handbooks have been long-standing handbooks. A couple of critical mistakes, though, they get made, and you don't know that a mistake has been made until you know a mistake has been made, right? So the pointers that we're going to talk about today are, for the most part, all real-life examples, but also things that can be useful to any practice owner. First, we need to say, what is an employee handbook? Honestly, if we're talking about a definition of an employee handbook, it's just a set of instructions that are given to employees of the practice that answer certain questions, and that's very generic, and that's because there aren't really rules about employee handbooks, and we're going to talk about the rules that are there, but there's no recipe, there's no set formula for what an employee handbook has to look like. Can it be digital? Can it be written? It doesn't have to be set up in chapters. It doesn't have to come in a leather-bound Bible, just whatever. There are no rules. And partially, one of the other things you need to learn, but partially the reason for this is that no state requires an employee handbook. Now, there are different rules about certain policies. And I think the easiest way to think about an employee handbook would be, let's say that you own your practice and there's no such thing as an employee handbook in your practice. And someone comes up to you and says, I would like to take off next Friday. What's your policy? And, if it's a small practice and you just opened, you make up your policy each time someone asks. And then at some point you say, you know what? I want everyone to know, instead of asking me, I want to put in writing what my answer will be so that everyone knows when they can take off and when they can't. So you put it in writing. And at that point, you have a policy, right? It's a written policy. Then someone comes to you and says, you know what? Cassandra over here keeps microwaving fish in the microwave for lunch, and it's stinking this place up. And you're like, man, you know what? There are a couple of behavior rules. I need everybody to shower. I need to stop making fish in the microwave. I need to make sure that people aren't using foul language around the children. And you decide, I hate to keep reminding people, so I'm going to put these in writing. Well, now you just added another policy, and so forth and so forth. And at some point, you have enough of these in writing that you have collected them. Now you have an employee handbook. And there are very few rules or principles that are at play that govern a small business like a dental practice that require certain things to be in or be out. But let's talk about some common mistakes. What are the things that I'm seeing practice owners do that kind of gets them in trouble? Because I do think one of the problems is everybody hears that you need an employee handbook. And so someone buys a practice or starts a practice and they're like, you know what, let me go get one. A lot of times people will hire an attorney. Sometimes people will hire like a third party provider. There are companies out there that provide these things for you. But a lot of times people are doing, and maybe this is the most common, a lot of times people are doing one of two things. They either had an employee handbook from a previous employer where they were associating at, or they go online and find an example. Now, all four of these, there's nothing wrong. There are pros and there are cons to each of these four methods, which are hiring an attorney, hire a third party, finding one from a previous employer, and finding one online. Again, pros and cons to each. The problem with the latter two, and that's using an employee handbook from a previous employer and finding one online, those present certain unique problems for you. Now, I will say sometimes even I would suggest that the third party people, not like attorneys are perfect, but some of these third parties, they are not lawyers and sometimes don't appreciate what rules apply to a business of your size. Some of these issues are about size of business, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But what are the problems with borrowing an employee handbook and getting one offline? They're cheap, so that's the pro, obviously, right? They're free, so can't beat free. Kind of. Number one problem that we've seen is it's the wrong state. So if you're here in Texas and you used to work in New Jersey, there are different rules that govern employee handbooks. And in addition to that, there are different rules that govern the employment relationship. So if someone had an attorney draft up a New Jersey-specific handbook, they are going to have those rules that are appropriate for New Jersey. And I'll tell you now, way more restrictive than in Texas. So you use that in Texas, all of a sudden you have put restrictions on you that didn't need to be there, that the law didn't put there. You self-imposed those restrictions, and it happens all the time. That's the same issue that happens with finding one online. You're in Florida and you Google a really good employment handbook and it's made from Minnesota. And all of a sudden you've got some Minnesota rules that apply to you, or whatever state it is. Sometimes there's a mismatch, and often there is a mismatch in law. And the danger is imposing something on yourself that you didn't have to do. Number two, the next problem, I see this a little bit more from people who use a former employer's handbook, which is the employee handbook that you're using is for the wrong size of business. Now, what you need to know about employment law is the federal, just how our government works, but the federal rules, some apply to employees of any size of business, but other rules only apply to employees of a certain size of business. So if you worked for a DSO that had 100 employees and you really liked their employee handbook and you just adopted it to your practice, it's going to have some restrictions in it that do not apply to a dental practice with only 5 employees. You did that to yourself. And the question is, do you know what rules those are and what rules they are not? And then finally, the other thing is, and this is kind of generic, but what I would categorize as wrong policies. And what I mean by that is you think, I just need to have a handbook, so I'll take some time in a few months and refine this. And then guess what? You're always busy, so you never have time to refine that book. And what happens, and this is probably the one that comes up the most, but what we'll see is somebody will have an issue with an employee and they'll call us and say, hey, Joe, this person is wanting me to do X and I don't want to do it. And we'll say, because a lot of times the law will say there's no rule on this unless it's in your employee handbook. And we'll say, well, what does your handbook says? Well, see, that's the problem. My handbook says this, but I actually just got it from, this place I used to work. And I don't think that's right. I'm like, yeah, but it's now how you have to deal with it. And so when I say wrong policies, it's basically you have adopted policies that you didn't really adopt on purpose. You did it because you're in a hurry, but you didn't think it through. And importantly, you didn't create your handbook with somebody who's walking you through the whole process and helping to explain potential consequences. But let's just say that you're insistent on getting one off Google. And I would say that the two other issues that come up when you're revising, maybe you're taking it, you're like, hey, I am going to make it specific to myself. Well, the number one thing that we see is that people will include some language that removes a handbook. See, a handbook's not supposed to be a contract. You actually go out of your way to state that it is not a contract and that it does not affect the at-will nature of the relationship. However, people who are working on their own employee handbooks, what they'll do is they'll put some type of language in there that makes it a contract. And obviously, they're not going to say this is a contract. They do things to implicate themselves in this agreement as a contract. Now, the other thing that they'll do, and this is almost as common, they'll include a policy that's illegal. And it's perhaps easier than you think, but it's not uncommon to get an employee handbook from a client who wants us to kind of review what they've done. And we'll look through it. And sure enough, there'll be something like, hey, you can't have this in there. And then, why not? Well, because the law says you cannot say that or you cannot do that. And that's okay. I mean, that's part of the process, right? You're trying to educate your client. And you have no reason to know because it's not like you're an employment lawyer. But that is something that comes up. And if you've got something illegal in your employee handbook, obviously, if this goes to some type of administrative hearing or a lawsuit even, that's not going to look good. Now, what are the calls that we get the most? I would say the number one call relates to compensation. Something will happen, and it's never like, how much am I supposed to get paid? It's stuff like, this person did this type of work. Should it be overtime? Or this person has worked this many hours in a week and she wants to allocate it to this week. Or, there are compensation questions that happen all the time, especially when someone is quitting or getting fired, things like that. The next most common, and maybe just as common, are relating to benefits. Hey, somebody wants to take off this many days, so I let her, but really, I gave her 3 weeks, but really I was only supposed to give her 2. And, what can I do with that? What can I not do with that? Or someone is leaving and they haven't taken a vacation in 5 years. And theoretically, my employment agreement says I owe them 5 weeks of vacation. Do I have to pay it? Questions like that. By the way, I think every year somebody asks me if they can drug test their employees. So that would be an example of a policy you would have in an employee handbook. Okay. So if there's a lot of things that can go wrong, why would I even want an employee handbook? Well, I would say that the most important reasons, and it's hard to rank these, but first one, I think that in our handbooks and in most handbooks, you're going to want to do something to help protect trade secrets. So you're going to have language about confidentiality, obviously honoring HIPAA, things like that, and asserting your ownership rights over things like patient names, stuff like that. You do have to be careful about restrictive covenants, especially depending on what state you're in, because you can cross over in that line, especially things like we see non-disparagement clauses, things like that. Your state may not allow that, or non-solicitation concepts. Your state may not allow it, or may have certain restrictions over it. Another reason to have it is for disciplinary reasons. Now, most states don't have like a requirement that you give somebody like 2 warnings and then on the 3rd strike they're out. It's not that. What you're trying to do is you're trying to set up a disciplinary structure so that if someone down the road claims that they were being treated unfairly, you have evidence to say, nope, I treated them exactly the same way I treat everybody else. I gave her 2 warnings, 3rd one, we let her go. And here's the documentation to prove it. So it's not that you are required to have it, it's that it can become useful to you later on down the road. Same thing with setting expectations like, hey, right in our handbook, it says don't microwave fish. And she did it 3 times. So sorry, I had to let her go. And it wasn't because she's 68, right? Anyway, the point is you set up expectations and the consequences of those expectations so that you can potentially have to defend yourself later on. And you show, no, I have a policy and I follow it. And I think that also this is where you're going to set out certain expectations. Again, you want to be careful about changing the at-will nature of your relationship. But so for instance, you would say, I ask that you give me a 2-week notice before you leave. You're saying, hey, it's not going to change the at-will nature of the relationship. I can still fire you. I don't have to give you a 2 weeks notice. But there are certain expectations you're trying to convey, trying to communicate to your employees. Now, the final thing I say about employee handbooks is I'm almost at a place where I say, when in doubt, leave it out. Like, it's better to not have one than to have one that you didn't put together on purpose. Now, I don't know that that's always going to be true, but it's my expression to encourage people that when you do put an employee handbook together, it's on purpose, that you mean and have thought through everything in that policy guideline. The real problem that we see, if I had to reduce it all, it's people get surprised by their own employee handbooks. And it's wild, and I get it, I do understand it, but it's kind of wild that they're getting bit by their own document. And it's because they have not read it, or to be fair, sometimes they read it, they just didn't fully understand it. It's written in this great fancy language, so they're like, well, my employer had 500 employees, so obviously they thought it was necessary, so I'm going to use it. And that might be the provision that bites you. So be careful, do it on purpose. I guess the shameless plug. This is a service that we offer. We have an attorney in our office who does employee handbooks. I mean, he just regularly pumps these things out, but it's a process, right? It's not just like this template that we pull off the shelf and say, here, these are your policies. No, it's you saying, this is how I want to run my practice. This is how I want to discipline people. These are the expectations I have for the way I want to run my business. And then we craft around it. And that's what any attorney should be doing. Even the third-party providers, that's what they should be doing. You should be having an employee handbook. You should have one, but it should be on purpose, one that's consistent with the law. And once you have it, by the way, you should probably have it signed by your employees. But once you have it, you need to then follow it and make sure that your employees understand it, that they're not surprised by what's in it either. Thank you so much. This is probably our last episode for the year. I really appreciate everyone's support. Thank you so much for listening to this. Like I said, if you want to get me a Christmas present, it's share this with your colleagues. Rate, review, and share. And it feels such like a goober because we see that on every YouTube video, but it genuinely helps. It helps the algorithm, helps us. It spreads the word to other dentists. I can't tell you how many times I have gotten a call with a dentist in trouble, and I'm like, man, I just did a Jaw Law episode on this. And I wish they could have hit rewind and heard that. But here we are. Thanks so much for all your help and patience. If you have episode ideas for 2025, please send them. It's 972-975-2215. Thank you so much. We'll see you next year.